Good morning, children. Welcome back to the lesson Mother's Day, written by J.B. Priestley. We already had a session on this. Before we start for the day, let us make an immediate recap of what we have already discussed. So, the story is all about a a housewife, a mother in the family who is not respected by her husband and children. Now her husband, now her neighbor has come to help her, that is Mrs. Fitzgerald, and she has promised her to help by exchanging the personality. First of all, she tried helping her by giving her some ideas, but Mrs. Fitzgerald has come to know that Mrs. Pearson cannot do that. Okay. Actually, Mrs. Pearson is a woman of in her 40s with a meek personality and fluttering tone. Worried, excited sort of tone. Whereas Mrs. Fitzgerald is very strong lady with a deep voice, rather Irish type of language, right? Then we have come to the conclusion that Mrs. Fitzgerald finally decided to help her by exchanging the personality. Now let us continue with the text. We are at page number 35, last part. Okay, all of you keep your textbook open with you. Yeah, page number 35, the last part. Mrs. Fitzgerald, coolly, you haven't got the idea. Bewildered, confused. Oh, I am sorry. I thought you asked me to let you do it. I did, but not as you. But I don't understand. You couldn't be me. Mrs. Fitzgerald, coolly, we change places or really bodies. You look like me and I look like you. Okay, but that is impossible. Mrs. Fitzgerald, how do you know? Ever tried it? Mrs. Pearson, no, of course not. Mrs. Fitzgerald, coolly, means in a cool mind, I have, not for some time, but it's still at work. Won't last long, but long enough for what we want to do. Learn it out east, of course, where they are up to all these tricks. Actually, she has learned this art from the east, and it would not last for long, but for some time it will work out, and that time span is sufficient for correcting the family. She holds her hand out across the table, keeping the cigarette in her mouth. Give me your hands, miss. Give me your hand. Give me stands for give me. Give me your hands, my dear Mrs. Pearson, dubiously, doubtfully. Well, I don't know. Is it right? Whether it will work out? Mrs. Fitzgerald, it is your only chance. Give me your hand and keep quiet a minute. Just don't think about anything. Means that both the parties should not think about anything. Taking her hands, now look at me. They stare at each other. Means look at each other. Muttering means uttering some sound. Astrastra dum, astrastra lum, astrastra lumbum, lumdum bona. So that is the magic spell, and that is uttered by Mrs. Fitzgerald. Then let us see what happens with that. I told you already the art of exchanging personality. That is the idea here. The little scene should be acted very carefully. Suppose you are acting this drama, you can act it very carefully. We are to assume that the personalities change bodies. Okay, we have to assume, we have to guess that the personalities exchange the body. After the spell has been broken and spoken, both women still grasping hands, holding hands, go lax. Lax means loose. Lax stands for loose, relax. Okay, lax, as if the life were out of them. Then both come to life, but with the personality of the other. Means they have exchanged the personality. Each must try to adopt the voice and the mannerism of the other. What is mannerism? The way of behaving. I think you can write down mode of speaking and movement. Okay, children, write down mode of speaking and movement is called mannerism of the other. So now Mrs. Fitzgerald is bold and dominating. Now you can see Mrs. Fitzgerald has become just like that of Fitzgerald. She has become bold. Dominating means commanding. What is dominating? Commanding type. Okay, COMMANDING, dominating. For example, dominating husband, dominating wife. And Mrs. Fitzgerald is nervous and fluttering. She is excited. Fluttering here means excited or agitated. Okay, fluttering here stands for excited. Mrs. Pearson now with Mrs. Fitzgerald personality. Now hereafter you have to understand Mrs. Pearson is with the personality of Mrs. Fitzgerald. Okay, now with Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality, see what I mean, dear. She notices a cigarette. Here, you don't want that. She snatches it and puts it in her mouth, puffing contentedly, means with satisfaction. So now who is smoking? Mrs. Fitzgerald? No, because now she has become Mrs. Pearson. Now Mrs. Pearson has become Fitzgerald. Now Fitzgerald generally smokes. So now who will smoke now? Mrs. Pearson with the personality of Fitzgerald. See the fun. So what will happen when the family members come? What will happen? When the family members come, they will see the mother or wife, for husband, wife, for children, mother would be smoking. So it will be a surprise. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, now with Mrs. Pearson's personality, looks down at her and see that her body has changed and gives a scream of fright. She felt, oh how meek she has become. So she feels bad. Mrs. Fitzgerald with Mrs. Pearson's personality, oh, it has happened. Okay, Mrs. Pearson, complacently, means with self-satisfaction. Of course, it has happened. Very neat. Didn't know I had it in me. Okay, Mrs. Fitzgerald, alarmed. Okay, now you can just opposite. You can take it. Okay, frequently it will not be written with Mrs. personality, with Fitzgerald personality. Now you can understand Mrs. Pearson is with Fitzgerald's personality. Okay, Mrs. Fitzgerald with Mrs. Pearson's personality. Both just opposite. Alarmed. See, alarmed, frightened. But whatever shall I do, Mrs. Fitzgerald? George and the children can't see me like this. So she feels that George cannot see me like this. Mrs. Pearson grimly, seriously, they aren't going to. That is the point. They will have me to deal with. Only they won't know it. Okay, I will be dealing, not you. Okay, you go. Mrs. Fitzgerald still alarmed. But what if can't change back? It would be terrible. But Mrs. Fitzgerald with Mrs. Pearson's personality feels whether it cannot be changed back. What will happen? She feels very alarmed, frightened. Mrs. Pearson, here study Mrs. Pearson. If you have to live my life, it wouldn't be so bad. You would have more fun as me than you have had as you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, but I don't want to be anybody else. She's now very much worried. Mrs. Pearson, actually Mrs. Pearson now Fitzgerald family wanted to correct the family members. Okay, now stop worrying. It is easier changing back. I can do it anytime. Okay, don't worry, I will change it. Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, do it now. Okay, she's that much worried. She wanted to change it back immediately. Not likely. I have got to deal with your family first. That is the idea, isn't it? Did you know how to begin with them? You said, well, I will show you. Okay, you said you cannot do. Now I will do it. Mrs. Fitzgerald, but what am I going to do? Then Mrs. Pearson, go into my house for a bit. Okay, you go to my house. Okay, there is nobody there. Then pop back, means come back. Pop back means come back and see how we are doing. You ought to enjoy it. Better get off now before one of them comes. Okay, anyway, family members would be coming now. So before that, you escape from here. Mrs. Fitzgerald nervously rising, because with great fear she is rising slowly. Yes, I suppose that is best. You are sure it will be all right. Okay, with that meek personality, sweet voice, fluttering voice, means excited voice, she is now going to Mrs. Fitzgerald's house. Mrs. Pearson, chuckling means laughing. It will be wonderful. Now off you go, dear. You go now. Mrs. Fitzgerald crosses and hurries out through the door, right, left to herself. Mrs. Pearson smokes away, lighting another cigarette, chain smoker, okay, and begins laying out the cards for patience on the table. Now children, you can have a real fun here now. Now let us see how Mrs. Pearson with Fitzgerald personality is going to deal with her husband, her daughter, her son. Okay, after, and it will be a toughest experience for the children and the husband. After a few moments, Doris Pearson comes bursting in left. She is a pretty girl in her early 20s. Underline. All of you underline what is she? I mean, she is pretty, beautiful girl in her 20s. 20 means it can be 21, 22, up to 29. Early 20s means up to 25. Who would be pleasant enough if she had not been spoilt. Actually, that girl is very good, but she is spoilt. Okay. Now, who will be dealing? Mrs. Pearson with Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality. Doris. Before she has taken anything in, Mom, you will have to iron my yellow silk. I must wear it tonight. She now sees what is happening and is astounded. What is astounded? Surprised. What are you doing? She moves down left center. So on seeing her mother smoking, she is so surprised. What actually she wanted her mother to do? Ironing her yellow silk. She was pressing, ironing her yellow silk, the dress. Then Mrs. Pearson now uses her ordinary voice, but her manner is not flattering and apologetic, but cool and incisive, very sharp. Incisive means sharp. Pearson, not even looking up. What do you think I am doing? Whitewashing the ceiling? Hey, can't you see what I am doing here? Am I whitewashing the ceiling? You can very much see what I am doing. What is that? Smoking. Doris, still astounded, still surprised, confused. But you are smoking. Mrs. Pierce, that's right, dear. No law against it, is there? Is there any law that I should not smoke? Doris, but I thought you didn't smoke. Mrs. Pearson, then you thought wrong. Okay, your thinking is wrong. Doris, are we having tea in the kitchen? Mrs. Pearson, have it where you like, dear. Whether in the kitchen, whether in the toilet, whether in the dining room, you take it wherever you want. Doris, angrily, do you mean it isn't ready? Mother, is it not ready? Mrs. Pearson, yours isn't, okay? Your tea is not ready. I have had all I want. Might go out later and get a square meal at the Clarendon. Okay, I had my tea and I will go for my meal in the Clarendon Hotel. Doris, hardly believing her ears. She cannot even believe the strange way her mother started behaving. Who might be going? I might, do you think? Who do you think? Hey, I will be going. Who do you think? Who else do you think? Doris, staring at her mom, what is the matter with you? Some changes. Mrs. Pearson, don't be silly. Hey, don't be silly. Doris, indignantly, means angrily. It is not me that is being silly, and I must say it is a bit much when I have been working hard all day and you can't even bother to get my tea ready. Did you hear what I said about my yellow silk? Hey, throughout the day I am working and you are not working and you cannot prepare my tea and you have not done my yellow silk. Mrs. Pearson, no, don't you like it now? I never did. Okay, that she did not do that work. What work? Ironing the yellow silk. Doris, indignantly, again angrily, of course I like it and I am going to wear it tonight, so I want it ironed. But I like that dress. I want it to wear for that night. Okay, Mrs. Pearson, want it ironed? Want it pressed? What do you think it is going to do? Iron itself? Do you think the cloth will iron itself? Doris, no, you are going to iron it for me. You always do, mother, my mom. Mrs. Pearson, well, this time I don't. Okay, I did it for you in the past, but I am not going to do it for you now. And don't talk rubbish to me about working hard. I have a good idea how much you do. Doris Pearson, I put in twice the hours you do. What you do? Double I do. And get no wages. I am not getting any wages. No thanks for it. Why are you going to wear your yellow silk? Where are you going? Oh, my dear darling, where do you want to go with the yellow silk? Who asked? Mother asked. Doris sulkily, means again angrily, out with Charlie Spence. Okay, you can underline. This girl has got a lover. His name is Charlie Spence. So she wanted to go along with him. Mrs. Pearson, why? Doris wildly. Why? What's the matter with you? Why shouldn't I go out with Charlie Spence if he asks me and I want to? Any objection? Go on. You might as well tell me. Mother, is there any objection that I am going along with Charlie Spence? Is there any? Mrs. Pearson severely means very sharply. Can't you find anybody better? I wouldn't be seen dead with Charlie Spence, buck-teeth and half-witted. Oh, that fellow. Okay, actually, mother is very sarcastic now, and she wanted to tell that man having buck teeth, means protruding teeth and half-witted, not a good person. Doris is telling, he is in like that. Mrs. Pearson, when I was your age, I would have found somebody better than Charlie Spence or given myself up as a bad job. Okay, suppose I were in your place. Okay, I would never choose that person. He is such a bad person, according to her. Doris, nearly in tears. Now, that poor girl in her 20s now is going to weep. Means she started crying. Oh, shut up. Doris runs out left. Mrs. Pearson chuckles and begins putting the cards together. After a moment, Cyril Pearson enters left. He is the masculine counterpart of Doris. So, dear children, now we have come to know how Mrs. Pearson with Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality treated the girl. How rough, very rough, rough manner, and she started weeping. Who started weeping? Doris started weeping. And she was first of all astounded, surprised to see her mother smoking. When she wanted her yellow silk iron, whose mother said no, it could not be done from her side now. When she asked about tea was not ready. And when she said about Charlie Spence, her lover, again mothers came down heavily on her, telling that she would never prefer such a bad boy as a lover. So, dear children, that is what we learned today. And today we'll wind up here. And before we conclude, let us make an immediate review of what we have discussed for the day. Today we started with the exchange of personality. Mrs. Fitzgerald, after uttering or muttering that mantra. What is the mantra? Ashtashta dam, ashtatra lam, ashtatra lam dhum bhona. After that, they both stood still, grasping hands, going lax. Finally, the personalities exchanged and the mannerism also exchanged. Now, Mrs. Pearson is behaving just like that of Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald is behaving just like that of Mrs. Pearson. But Mrs. Pearson is now enjoying that new personality, whereas Fitzgerald is feeling bad because that excited voice and the mannerism of Pearson she didn't like. Okay, anyway, the purpose is Mrs. Pearson to control the family, and before somebody, one of the members of the family entered who left the place, Mrs. Fitzgerald left the place, and Mrs. Pearson started controlling. And who did come first? Daughter Doris Pearson. And what did she want the mother to do? Ironing her yellow silk. Why? Because she wanted to go to that night outside along with to see or to meet her lover Charlie Spence. And she also wanted her tea be ready, but mother was smoking, and it was astounding experience for her because she never happened to see her mother smoking, and even mother scolded her whether she could not see properly, whether she was whitewashing the ceiling. Then she realized, no, you were smoking, like that. Okay, then finally who turned to be very sad and started weeping? Doris. By then who came there? The masculine part, the male part, the counterpart of Doris, that is Cyril Pearson. Tomorrow we'll learn about Cyril Pearson's experience. Thank you, children. Have a nice day ahead.